management doesn't necessarily command respect automatically. You need to make sure that people feel like they're making a difference or that they're a part and that their part is respected and that they understand what they're supposed to be doing and how to get there. Welcome to the Cut Your Learning Curve podcast. I'm your regular host, Nate Cooper, and with me this season, I have Eve McKnight as my co-host. In this season of Cut Your Learning Curve, we're sponsored by Swarm, a digital product design agency and management consultancy. Swarm helps you connect the dots and mitigate the risks associated with launching a digital product, website, or idea. Thanks for joining me, Eve. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Eve McKnight. I teach about project management all over the United States with my company, Little Owl, and I'm also the Director of Learning here at Swarm.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me, Eve. If you're new to the podcast, Cut Your Learning Curve is where we help you rethink how you can learn new skills that benefit your professional career and the projects that you want to develop. So let's jump into the episode. So this season, we are talking quite a bit about the future of work, how organizations work, how work works, all kinds of things related to the technology world and the changing economy and the pandemic. And today we decided to talk about leadership and management. And the framing question that I wrote for this episode was, what is management and how does that contrast with leadership? And I think we both have strong opinions on this. I don't know, do you feel strongly that you want to go first, Eve, or do you want me to start?
Well, if you'd like to start, Nate, that's fine.
I mentioned to you before, because we were going to record last week, and then it gave me a whole nother week to think about this topic. But I was actually thinking about a personal experience that I had, personal to me in a professional context, where I was given a position within a company to be essentially a leader, in that there were managers and people with management titles, but I was not a manager and I was not promoted to be a manager. I was promoted to be in a leader position. In other words, your job is to be in charge of something, an area of the business. And because I needed to get this job done, I recruited and I worked with another leader, that there was me and one other person, to basically recruit a team from within the organization of people that we kind of led for this area of the business. And it was kind of amazing because we weren't tasked with recruiting a team. We just did it because the job needed to get done. And by the end of it, actual managers who had direct reports, were sending people to our team because they saw what an impact it had within the organization. And it was a really positive experience for me doing that. But a really negative thing came out of it, and that, like, a lot of the managers at this place, they got really upset and they started telling my direct manager that me and this other person that were sort of leading this team, that we think of ourselves as managers, and you think you're a manager and you're really not, and you should understand and respect the managers. And it was a really confusing thing for me culturally. I mean, I mostly worked at smaller places too, so this was kind of a bigger company. But that environment and that situation, where I started to realize that, like, people who saw themselves as managers when they got recruited to that role really identified with this title. And I had managers there who I was very happy with, and I felt like were good leaders. And then there were other managers there who I had to work with that I maybe didn't see eye to eye with at all times. But the fact that this title caused such friction for me in my life was a really interesting experience that kind of came up over this past week when I was thinking about what does it mean to be a leader versus a manager. Because I do feel like a lot of the times in my professional experience, when I've had to be in charge of stuff, I often think of myself as a leader. I've led hackathons and had to lead teams within hackathons, for example. And it's not necessarily had the title manager in all cases, but it's an interesting dichotomy there, where there's this like label that tends to have a lot of serious connotations, I think, for people in terms of their own sort of identity and mission in life and how they relate to others. And so I don't know what to draw from that, other than, like, that's just something I thought I would share in the context of this.
I mean, I hear you, Nate, and it sounds like that's like a very specific experience that really struck you. It would be interesting to me, though, what you see as really a definition of the distinction between being a leader and being a manager. Because I have my own thoughts, so I thought I'd ask you first.
What do I think is the difference between a manager and a leader?
Yeah, in terms of definitions.
I mean, I was thinking about that too. I mean, I think it's a difference maybe between strategy and implementation. Like a leader is thinking at a very sort of strategic level, big broad stroke ideas, driving vision, in some ways, whereas a manager is somewhat responsible for executing on those things and responsible for ensuring that those things happen with a specific group of people, is maybe one way I would think about it, or how people think about it. I don't know. That would be my definition, I guess.
I think mine's in the ballpark. I worked with one company, and the CEO that I had ups and downs with, I would say, certainly learned a lot from. He said, leadership was, there's the hill, and then the manager figures out how to get there.
Mm-hmm.
So that the leader really provides the vision, and the manager executes that strategy. So strategy versus tactics is the way I always learned about it.
All right, so it's pretty close.
Yeah. No, I definitely think there's some overlap. I'm not sure everyone who works in organizations sees this or understands this. It's interesting to me that people graduate from K through 12 and even college with a healthy understanding of hopefully how to write well and communicate well in English, given that we're in the United States, but no training, even remotely, in the basics of managing themselves, others. And I feel like so much of it is not even necessarily that complicated. A lot of it is just sort of discipline and balance and a few other things. I think on a macro level, first of all, it's interesting because Nate and I talk about things like lean, and in other sessions, and we haven't talked about lean in here, but we've certainly discussed agile and lean and a whole bunch of these concepts that are out there in the world. And I think what leaders do is they decide the direction of an organization. And I actually think people don't really even understand, in sort of the mainstream press, there's a lot of news about manufacturing jobs shifting from Michigan to Bombay or China or Bangladesh, et cetera. But there really isn't nearly, say 100 to 1, the number of articles about what happened behind the scenes at some organization before all that outsourcing occurred. Mm-hmm. And there really has been a seismic transformation in the way companies organize, large companies, global international companies with more of a US base, just that's really my knowledge area. And I do think that's leaders that decided this was going to happen. And I think that's really what the MBA schools teach today. They teach how to pivot. I don't think they actually necessarily teach much of managing anything, based on my own experience with MBAs. And, I feel like people don't really appreciate, and then management consulting plays a role in this. We're 20 or 30 years in now, but man, when you look at the way roughly started with Milton Friedman, he was at least the most famous of them, but this commitment to maximizing stock value and or really figuring out ways to earn a lot of venture capital money, both of which are very specific targets. They're not always the same, but there's all these strategies and sort of tactics you apply therefrom. And I just think we really do not appreciate the phenomenal ways internally organizations have been able to execute simply based on a valuing of stakeholder value, upping the stock over all else. That has become the priority. I think there's a whole bunch of complicated reasons why, in addition to Milton Friedman himself. But what's been interesting now, and I don't know how much this is going to be a question of Nate, is this a direction you want to go? I think there's a handful of questions that leaders today have that they didn't have years ago.
I'm wondering how this connects to so are you saying that managers within current large scale international companies are tasked with looking at the ends and not so much the means, and
no, I think the leader sets the tone, decides where we want to go, and I think managers have been extraordinarily successful and efficient in achieving those ends. And without going too sort of in the weeds, but and a side product of all of this is at a very large number of organizations, the number of middle managers, which was yet another middle class job, have really been hollowed out, the fraction of the number there was. IBM is a great example of this. It's interesting because it comes from a bunch of different theoretical sides, but mostly I think people don't actually appreciate how astonishingly nimble these companies have become, in part because of survival. Nokia is a great cautionary tale about being very successful in the market and then just not moving fast enough and just getting crushed in something like 18 months. So I can see why they chose to do it. And it's interesting to me to see the way managers do execute that strategy. I do think the big question for leaders today, now that they have been able to maximize stock value, that we have consolidated markets in the United States, all the lobbying efforts support this, makes a lot of sense to me, is, this guy, Tim Wu, he writes about antitrust for the New York Times, among other issues. And he was at Davos this year, which is a big corporate gathering. And he said, walking around, that I thought at times I had mistakenly wandered into a business casual Bernie Sanders rally. Unrestrained capitalism has gone too far. Corporate greed has endangered the planet. The time has come for radical change. And this is really something to hear from leaders. And so the whole idea is what's called stakeholder capitalism. The idea that companies must also elevate the interests of workers, the environment, and local communities alongside stock shareholders. To me, that is like the issue, because it's extremely hard. And I'm not sure how it really plays out. But in a way, I think a lot of the world is dependent on it. So to me, that's like the big thing happening with leaders today. I think with managers, it's very interesting because that's the area I really train in. That's the area I'm a specialist in. I work with a lot of young managers. And I think it really speaks to a very specific personality type, just based on my own experience. And I think there are all kinds of ways to kind of fine tune and get better at it. And I think it's such a, when you think about like a curtain or a piece of fabric, I think it's these managers that knit everything together.
So am I wrong to, because you talked about a lot of things there, so I want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. It sounds like you're talking about responsible capitalism and the need for it and the need to have leadership bought into it. But then you also spoke about how there's fewer managers. And are you saying that managers are the best people to implement this, or they tend not to, they can't, because they're just executing a vision that doesn't include more of a focus on the environment and the ecosystem and
I think
workers?
it's up to, and I feel this way actually in project-based work as well. I feel like there's a person with a vision for what we're making, and then there's project managers to execute thereof. And I talk about this a lot because I work in the sort of the sub area of project management.
Right.
Mostly I think of managers broadly. They might contribute to the idea of what is our vision, what is our mission statement. We did a couple exercises this week just on this topic. But ultimately, I think managers are there to execute whatever vision is decided upon. And I think that's their job. And I think there's all kinds of ways that managers can get better at it. And I think a lot are very good. And so that's I sort of see them as the foot soldiers. The mid-level, like the captains maybe, and maybe like the other people doing the work would be more of like sort of your privates in an army analogy.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I always thought as like that, like leaders don't necessarily need to require someone to follow them. Leadership is about striking out and inspiring people to follow your lead. Whereas something in the terms of management, kind of like you're saying, there's a specific thing to do and your job is to make sure it gets done.
No, absolutely. And you said in the very beginning about not following, but I think it is about inspire. I think it's also for leadership, frankly, much more intangible, about inspiring and, giving people a vision that really resonates. I think Steve Jobs was just a textbook leader in the sense that he was like, here's where Apple needs to go. And there are many, many stories of him really not being the most compassionate of managers, but his vision was unparalleled. And then he was smart enough to appreciate that he needed to hire good managers around him. I think Tim Cook today is the ultimate manager, the ultimate effective manager. And he was brought in to really clean up the supply chain. He did this phenomenally well. And ever since, this is sort of what Apple's been known for, is not necessarily really breaking new boundaries, right? Not a lot has really been created in terms of new technology, except for the Apple Watch. And mostly they've just bettered the stuff they have and sort of strengthened their ecosystem from end to end and maximize stock value. But like they haven't sort of rethought how subways work or something. Like they've sort of stayed within their playing field. And, the whole thing with Steve Jobs, I think, was he came up with stuff that really did marry art and science in a way we hadn't seen before. We were talking yesterday and something else about UX design, and I believe it was Steve Jobs, above all people, who really brought UX design to the fore in terms of how we think about software, and just cleaned Microsoft's clock for about a decade. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, and Tim Cook is like the consummate sort of supply chain analyst. Like that's what he's like known for,
Oh yeah.
is focusing on how does everything get streamlined and maximized in terms of profitability. And to your point, like he's not necessarily thinking, I mean, that there may definitely be innovative things about that, but it's not quite as like forward thinking in a way that Steve Jobs is like big picture, like how do we disrupt how people consume media, for example. So
Exactly.
it's definitely true. But yeah, I mean, I guess like from my perspective, just because I've had a lot of personal experience sort of being a manager and also being a leader, is that I've never thought of it as like an automatic thing that management necessarily, I mean, the way I think about it, and maybe I would frame it differently, but the way I've often said it in the past when I was kind of more rebellious, because I'm anti-authoritarian, is management doesn't necessarily command respect automatically. You need to make sure that people feel like they're making a difference, or that they're a part, and that their part is respected, and that they understand what they're supposed to be doing, and how to get there. And that could be called effective management. But I think also someone who is kind of a natural leader in a management position tends to inspire that anyways, because someone who's a natural leader, I think, can really get to people's sort of core inspirations and looks out for understanding kind of what the group should be working towards. Not all. I think to your point, like Steve Jobs is a really interesting example of somebody who's very forward looking as a leader that people followed, and he was also an asshole. But I think, the idea of being like in a leadership position is that you are somebody that, just by nature of what you talk about and how you talk about it, that people naturally want to listen. And that's something that I think is very helpful if you're managing people, because I think one of the hardest things about being a manager, and to your point about lack of training, is like, how do you get people to do their jobs, and how do you make sure that they have what they need to do their jobs, and that they, that you're removing blockers, that you aren't being a blocker. And I think that that's, if and I'm sure we all had experiences with having bad managers. I think it's often boils down to that. It's like communication issues, like throughput issues, like lack of context, all of these things that could be resolved if there was a clearer sort of vision or direction that people understood together and naturally fell into it. You know what I mean? So
I think I take apart sort of the two things you just said. I think there's the second part, which I would say is much more leadership, like connection to a vision, which I totally
yeah,
agree with. And then the first part, which is a little bit like, if you're going to drive in a car, does the car have gas? Like really basic stuff. When you talked about how do you make sure they have what they need to do their jobs, I'd argue that a vision and a broader direction is certainly part of it, especially for long-term gigs. Longer term than like a couple weeks or a couple months. But other than that, it's just such an elementary thing. To be a manager is to ensure that your team has what they need. And it's fascinating to me that this isn't something we even just teach in high school or college, just as a very basic fundamental thing. Because, some huge percentage of people in the world are going to go out and work with teams, whatever industry, whatever capacity. And, I talk about this a lot in my work. And I feel like the managers that also derive the most intrinsic pleasure from their day-to-day work, because I really sort of watch this as well, is the ones who just think it's cool to think about how do we get a little bit more out of the team. Not in a like, let's grind them down sort of a way, but in a, maybe we move meetings to Monday morning. Maybe we think about having these end of week check-ins. What can we do to optimize performance and enhance sort of our overall attitude? Along with, does this software they use work well? Could this other software work better? Whatever tools they need. I feel like they're really actually an advocate for the people they are managing. To me, that's the best of what it has to offer. And I wholeheartedly agree that it doesn't command respect. I think it doesn't command respect in a couple different directions. One, there's this idea of slow-moving bureaucracy, which is sometimes true and sometimes strictly a perception. I think certainly in the tech space, I can't even describe how much I think operational matters in the tech space simply come because a group of self-learners are the ones that kind of run the road, like run the whole thing in tech. And then getting back to distributed networks of the design of the internet itself, like it really attracts a crowd that isn't wild about hierarchy. And I think this really shows up in the way all kinds of companies organize themselves today. So I think, like, for example, I teach around Scrum, which again is this system for developing software. I don't think it's a coincidence that no one is called a manager in the whole system.
Mhm.
Like the whole title has been banished. And instead you have something like Scrum Master, which sounds like something from a video game or Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, it's hilarious. So they're not a master of anything. It's just funny to me. So, and I think it's certainly there. That said, I think effective managers are just absolutely critical to realizing any goal anywhere, for any type of work.
Mm.
And, if I had anything I say is my calling is helping those people do what they, aim to achieve. I don't think I'll ever be the one deciding which hill we're going to run up. Like, again, getting back to where we started leadership, we're going to that hill, like the general in an army. And then, all these captains figuring out how they're going to mass their privates to get there. And privates isn't soldiers, just to clarify that point. Anyway, and, it's a really interesting exercise in behavior and in human organization and information. It's both, and physical goods as needed. And I'm very passionate about it personally. So.
It's interesting. I mean, like, I just was thinking about how, because you mentioned we were talking a lot about vision and values this week, and it's interesting to me how often people on my team specifically bring up like how I'm focused on like kind of this work-life balance and health and things, and how that's unusual for places that they've worked and stuff. And I guess because I kind of come from that world of engineering and working yourself to the bone and hackathons and stuff, that I see the real effects of burnout. And I just feel like it's a factor to keep in mind, in terms of like the idea that somebody is, if the goal of the manager is to make sure that the job gets done, then why wouldn't you factor in like employee health? I mean, that just becomes like like somebody who's burnt out, you're going to lose a tremendous amount of productivity. And maybe the answer is like you throw more people at it, which some places do. I don't know if that's the most effective strategy from a business financial standpoint, and definitely not from a societal standpoint. But it's interesting to me just that like that's not something that more people kind of consider when they're sort of thinking about like workloads and things like that, and just how to get, like you said, how to get the most out of like your team, and make sure that the job's getting done.
I mean, I think government agencies think about this. This is a really big part of the way workforce planning happens in places like France and Sweden and New Zealand and Australia. The byproduct of lack of government regulation of what you just said is you do have a lot of women and caretakers leaving the workforce. Like this just happens all the time. And it's accelerating, as is all things under COVID. I also think, to your credit, I actually think there are advantages to the sort of environments that Nate was talking about. Certainly for the kind of work that engineers do. I've described this before. I just think of it like whales. Like whales like take a deep breath and then they just submerge for a while. And that's just sort of how I associate with coding, that they're sort of locked in or dropped in or whatever terms you guys use. That it takes these periods of uninterrupted concentration and focus to achieve. We were looking at a piece called sort of maker time, and I would call that maker time. I just don't think that's true for all industries and all kinds of work. So also not for nothing, the conversation we had this week was not with any engineers. So sure, it made a lot of sense to me. And I can see the appeal. Like I've done all-nighters. I majored in English at school and I've done all-nighters on that. And there was something certainly attractive, maybe not healthy, about just sort of shutting down everything else and finding a quiet space and just working for 10 hours. I felt pretty lousy afterwards, but
oh, absolutely. I'm not saying it's not a good way to do work.
Yeah.
I mean, like I wouldn't have done like a 3-day hackathon on a bus, I mean, you definitely throw out a lot of self-care regimens when you do that, believe me.
But there's also a good side to it. Like you guys really generated a lot of creativity. So I just think it cuts both ways. I also wanted to say, as much as I think mostly I feel like managing is just sort of hard work in the dirt. But I also think leadership is not in any way easy. Like this thing I was just talking about with stakeholder capitalism, the pressures for CEOs to produce top-level stock year after year after year are extraordinary. Most of America's, or many, I don't know about most, of America's future retirement savings are riding on the stock market. It's in a very, I think, highly risky way, whether it's state pensions or 401ks or like in ways that certainly the initial people who sort of invented some of the ideas around retirement would have never endorsed. A lot of pension funds at a state level expect a degree of return that well exceeds typical stock growth, thereby incentivizing them to really seek out high risk things in terms of the things they invest in. And, all of this was done to essentially sort of sign off on tax cuts at the state level. This is one of the reasons. It's all pretty involved, in my opinion. But I do think being a leader and striking out and having a vision, and an interesting person also is the head of Microsoft today, Nadella. Sorry if I'm pronouncing his name wrong. Satya. He's really turned around an organization on a personnel and culture level that was highly combative to more of a growth mindset. They've also shifted the core of what they even offer. Like I heard in the last 2 years, they even broke up their Windows operating team, the team that develops all of that, to focus on these other things. I mean, they still obviously churn out Windows on a regular basis, updates. But, going back to 1999, that was just their cash cow. Windows ran 98% of the world's computers. It was amazing. So his ability to pivot, and also, I guess, because, I know you mentioned it well, Nate, to think about the culture of his organization, I think it's pretty hard to save one of the biggest organizations out there. And there's a lot of attention paid to the work he has achieved as a leader. So I think I just have a lot of respect for both roles. I think as a society, I think it's kind of something that's part of being in the first world. It's always amazing to me that people just take for granted that stuff works, that this group of people was able to achieve whatever, I mean, and when I see things working well, which is typically a blend of leadership working with managers to execute successfully, I feel real joy personally.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there. I just keep thinking about the idea of like influence and how important that is. I think it across all of these touch points, because I think to be an effective leader, you have to influence, and increasingly to be an effective manager, it's not enough that you just tell people what to do and they do it. That you have to kind of have some degree of influence. And I think the leaders are sort of natural influencers. Managers may or may not have influence, depending on probably their degree of training. But it's just this idea of like, how do you get people to move in a direction together is kind of the common thing, I guess, between the two.
And I think that's a huge challenge. I think on a managerial level, once the leader has set the direction, is hopefully is there's some very specific tactical things you can do at the beginning so they feel more heard, the team itself, the group of people themselves, so that they feel like, oh right, I did buy into this, I am excited to be here. Everything from first interview to onboarding to introduction to team members to there's a lot of bang for the buck in the beginning of all of this, in my opinion. And then you reinforce, make it transparent with leadership where we're going, remind people of the value of the work they're doing. I mean, I think there's actually a whole art to this. I teach this in my classes if anyone's interested. And then the other thing that I think, because I know we're supposed to be really talking also about future, is, it's an interesting conversation. David Brooks, a few others write about this. Do leaders really need a grounding in the humanities? In philosophy, in religious studies, in great literature, to sort of derive those ideas and then push them out into leadership? I don't know. It's always interesting to look at what's happening in education right now and then think about how will that affect the workforce later. So there's a huge decline in people just taking classes in the humanities across the board. College has gotten wildly expensive in the United States, and people just don't see the value. So it's sort of interesting. I'm curious how when Gen Z starts to rise into leadership roles, will that affect the way we sort of see these things? And the initial challenge I posited in the beginning, this thing about stakeholder capitalism, I don't really see how we would survive without it as a society, as a democracy, as a planet. And I think there's some really smart people working on it, and jury's out, we'll see. But I do think it's like the question for leadership. So, and then I agree with what you were saying about being an influential manager. I also think the thing that makes this, from a future of work standpoint, exceedingly difficult is one, lack of standardized training at all, and two, the continued turnover in the workforce. One HR recruiter talked to me about how people in tech turn over every 8 to 12 months. I believe the Amazon tech force turns over 20% every year. So that's just not a lot of time to get to know people. Because independent of all our fancy tools and fancy technology, you're just talking about humans working together. And there is something to be said that I think the sheer speed of how work happens today, how market products are rolled out to market, how we communicate, can in some ways certainly make the job of managing really challenging.
Yeah. There's a lot to think about here. We didn't even get to talk about Zappos, which I thought would have been an interesting topic, but I want to kind of see where we landed. Was there anything else that you thought it was important to talk about for this episode?
Just shout out to leaders and managers everywhere. I admire your day-to-day. That's all I had.
Cool. Do you want to tell people how to find you, Eve?
Oh, sure. So I'm Eve. Again, I consult on project management. You can find me at littleowl.us. Also, I teach classes online all over now as the online world works. Facebook.com/littleowl with a 1.
And I'm at Nate Cooper on Twitter. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to learn with us today. This has been the Cut Your Learning Curve podcast sponsored by Swarm. Don't forget to go to swarmnyc.com/learn. There you can sign up for our email newsletter and connect with us on social media.
Thanks, Eve. And again, my name is Nate Cooper. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great day and happy learning.